All right, welcome to the latest Fanalyst interview. I'm Ethan Skolnick. You can find me at Ethan J. Skolnick, also at 5 Reasons Sports on occasion. And we are joined here by Alex Kennedy, who I feel like I met a lifetime ago. You can follow him. Let me make sure I get this right. Alex Kennedy, NBA, is that correct?
Yep,
Alex
that's right.
Kennedy, Alex Kennedy, NBA. And are you still based in the Orlando area?
Yep, live in Lakeland, just outside of Orlando.
It's all the same thing. Once
It
you go
is.
up there, it's all the same space. But I met Alex a long time ago when he was like a little whippersnapper covering the NBA, and now he's become a media mogul. And what we're going to talk about today is kind of the way some of these networks, these sites, have kind of cropped up in NBA spaces, in NFL spaces, and his new project is Basketball News, which has a lot of really talented writers, including a couple that I know very well, Nikias Duncan, Brian Fonseca, and others, and building a platform with some room to grow around the country. But before we do that, I want to get into how you started in this space, because you were not very old when you did.
Yeah, so I fell in love with basketball at a young age. And then at like 11, 12 years old, I started going on these message boards and like forums and just debating people, watching games, talking about them. I was on there way too much. So I was constantly on there. And then they actually had like a writing staff at the message board. And they said, hey, would you want to write for the main page, the message board, for the writing staff? So I ended up joining their writing staff when I was, I think, 13 years old. And then that was a website called Just B-Ball. They're no longer around. And then I left them to go with Real GM when I was 14 years old. And when I was at Real GM, I was just doing kind of analysis articles and, kind of just blogging basically. And then one of the other Real GM writers interviewed, they actually got credentialed for a Warrior shoot around. And I remember they interviewed Speedy Claxton. And I was thinking, okay, he works at the same outlet that I do. Is it possible for me to, get a credential and go cover games? So I reached out to the Orlando Magic PR department, Joel Glass and Jason Wallace at the time, and they were super helpful. They basically said, hey, you can come cover some games, but because you're so young, you have to bring a chaperone. So it was embarrassing looking back, but my dad would come with me to all the games. So we ended up going to, I would say, like 2 or 3 games a month, and we would drive down there from Tampa. And yeah, I mean, I got to interview a lot of players, build some connections. And for the first like 2 or 3 years, I was just pretty much kind of staying in the background and learning from watching the different beat writers and the other journalists. And then by the time I turned 17, 18 years old, I started, building relationships with agents, executives, people around the NBA. And that's when I started actually I left Real GM and started getting paid to write and work for various places. I think that's when we met shortly after that when I was with Steve Kyler at Hoops World. So yeah, then when I was 18, 19, it went from me being like the young kid in the locker room that like the players would talk to because they felt bad and were trying to be friendly to like all of a sudden I was the same age as some of these incoming draft prospects, and we liked the same music and had some things in common. So I was able to kind of connect with some of the 19, 20-year-old players, and it almost became a little bit of an advantage. So yeah, that's how I kind of got my start.
Yeah, that's interesting. It does become an advantage sometimes when you can relate to the players. I remember that about 30 years ago for me. But you mentioned Steve Kyler and Hoops World, and I know Steve's moved on to some other project this stage, but that thing was built to a fairly significant enterprise. But you worked for some others, too, along the way before Basketball News.
Yeah, so I was at Hoops World, and then it became a site called Basketball Insiders, which was the same staff at Hoops World. We moved over, and then yeah, I left for Hoops Hype and USA Today, and I was there for 3.5 years. One of the reasons I fell in love with the NBA was the business side, transactions, rumors, all of that. I've always been super interested in that, and that's why I started reaching out to agents and executives. So to go to Hoops Hype, which is known for their rumors page, and they cover the business side of the NBA so well, I had a blast over there. So yeah, I was there for a while doing a lot of long form, behind the scenes type pieces, interviewing agents, executives about, their job and, what it's like to when a player demands a trade, what it's like for an agent who gets fired, the whole recruiting process for an agent, all that kind of like business of basketball stuff. I got to cover that in depth in addition to transactions and rumors. So it was great. I had a great time there. USA Today was awesome too. I was doing videos for them, and they would grab some of my articles and run them on the site, and then also sometimes the newspaper. So it was a really good experience. And I think it was really great for building more relationships because, I knew that Hoops Hype was popular around the NBA, but I didn't realize how many players, executives, agents read it until I actually started writing there. And
Yeah.
people would like come up to me like, oh, I read your last article on da-da-da. And it was crazy to see how many people would go to Hoops Hype religiously.
Yeah, no, the Hoopside platform, even for those of us who were, like in the so-called mainstream publications at the time, was a big deal because when they quoted your article that you wrote somewhere, it got more buzz. And you would find, again, that maybe, like you said, the agent, the executive, the coach, the player who would not necessarily read the local outlets, they would just go to Hoopside. Similarly to how in football, Pro Football Talk kind of became that central place where you had to be found, basically, and that because that's where everybody went. All right, so let's get into this, and then I want to get into the business as a whole. But the concept behind basketball news, the types of writers that you seem to be bringing in there, fit kind of the Fanalyst profile in the sense that it's a younger demo. It's maybe people who should be beat writers somewhere, but they're not. But they're breaking down the game in kind of a unique way that the traditional beat writer did not, right? Am I kind of onto something there?
Yeah, I think a big part of it too, like whenever they came to me, they said, here's your budget. You can build a staff however you kind of want. And they wanted a mix of journalists and players. So first, we kind of addressed the players. We have James Posey, Rex Chapman, Atan Thomas. We've had a few other contributors, but those are the main players that contribute weekly. And then on the writer side, the main thing was we wanted to have kind of a diverse group where some of them focus more on film breakdowns and that side of things, like Nikias Duncan or Jackson Frank, some of these guys that we brought in. And then others, we kind of had more storytellers, interview, quote-driven feature type pieces. And then the whole goal overall was just go after people that are, really hungry, ambitious. And I think, basically I was trying to find people that were like myself 10 years before, who, were, so like we've had a few people that got their job because they just reached out to us nonstop over email and they were just so persistent. And we were like, wow, this guy really wants it. So yeah, that was one thing. And then, I think the other thing was just, we didn't want to have like clickbaity, hot take type stuff. Like, I think that's so prevalent today and we wanted to really avoid that. I learned at Hoops Hype that there's such an audience for diehard smart NBA fans. Like people who came to Hoops Hype, they, know every player on, their favorite team and they want more information. They want to know the salary data. They want to know what transactions are happening behind the scenes. Like, so they know all the agent names. So our thing was, we don't need to dumb this down and have clickbait and all that. We can appeal to those diehard fans and there's way more of them than people think. So that's kind of been the thought process. And people like, Nikias, who you mentioned, his articles are so in depth. I think if you were just a casual fan that didn't really know about the NBA, you might not understand some of it, but his articles have been doing really, really well. And his, platform has grown and there's clearly a big audience for people that want that kind of content. So we've tried to kind of fill that and again, have a diverse group where we have the player perspectives, writers, and just all kinds of different articles, podcasts, and videos.
Yeah, I mean, and Nikias, you mentioned somebody who kind of did it his own way. I mean, as you and I both know, he started by writing Facebook posts on his phone, and it essentially became a little empire that he's got here in addition to the podcast. But you mentioned transactions, and I think that's interesting because we have found that, at 5 Reasons and other places, that really the NBA, the hardcore NBA fan now it seems to be more interested in the transactions than necessarily the games, right? Like that's when we do our biggest numbers is transaction season, but they know the salary cap, they know who the agents are, they know the different relationships and all of that stuff. It does seem like, at least in the NBA, I think more so than any of the other sports, it's kind of become the new hot stove. The transaction drives it. But like you also said, the strategy stuff drives it, intelligent strategy conversation, which again, not to disparage any of my former colleagues in the mainstream NBA media, but is more difficult to produce, I think, when you're dealing with, hardcore deadlines of I just got to get a game story out, or I got to get to this practice, or I got to get to this game. I do feel like from a creator standpoint and a consumer standpoint, transactions and strategy are kind of where it's at right now for the NBA.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, you mentioned the mainstream side of things. I remember at USA Today, they would say, write it as if your grandma who knows nothing about the NBA is going to read it. So that was kind of the approach where you're not going to delve into, salary information and details of a trade and all that kind of stuff. You're keeping it pretty basic. So we've kind of delved deeper than that. And that's been our big goal. But yeah, I totally agree. I mean, our traffic is best in July, February, and around the draft, whenever there's trades happening, free agent signings. I think people are so excited about the prospect of landing these huge players. And I think also in the NBA, either your team's a contender and those fans are paying close attention, or your team's near the bottom and you're already looking toward the future and who can we draft, who can we sign, who can we trade for. So yeah, I think that's definitely, and it's different for other sports too. Like I don't think that happens in the NFL. I mean, it's so different in the NFL too, because there's only 17 games now, so everyone's focused on the games. And there's also not as many free agents, especially notable free agents changing teams like we see in the NBA. So I think that's part of it. We've seen so many superstars play for multiple teams throughout their career. So in the NFL, you could say, oh, I want to land this player, but it's super unrealistic. In the NBA, you can actually throw that out there and it might actually happen, especially if you're in a certain market or, a certain team, fan of a certain team. So yeah, we've definitely seen that. And for us, like we've tried to cover the transaction and rumor mill really well without going overboard, because we do still want to have some coverage of the games. It's a conversation that we have a lot, kind of finding that balance, because we don't want to ignore what's happening on the court, especially when we do have these great writers that are awesome at breaking down film and the X's and O's and everything there. We want to, take advantage of that. But we've kind of found a way to do a little bit of both. Like Nikias wrote an article for us recently looking at where Domantas Sabonis could be traded to. But in the first part of the article, it's a film breakdown of his game, explaining why he's so effective and why he can dominate, and then looking at which teams that kind of skill set fits into. So it's we found a little bit of a balance, a way to kind of do both. But yeah, I mean, there's no question that if you're in the NBA media business, you have to be focused on transactions, at least, a bit.
Yeah, it's the who and it's the why, really. I think that's the combination that fans want these days. All right, so let's take it to the next step here, because obviously mainstream outlets are still operating. I mean, you mentioned if you're in a city like I'm in Miami, it's always about transaction season, because every player is photoshopped into a Heat jersey. we just know the way that works for obvious reasons. It's 82 degrees outside here right now. But I guess as you look at where your platform can go, we see more of these types of platforms are going into the space. We see newspapers are hiring fewer and fewer writers. Some of the national outlets, the 4-letter network, seem focused on 3 teams and that's it. Whereas you're going to cover more of everything. How do you continue to differentiate yourself going forward, and where do you see the platform going?
Yeah, I think the big thing for us is just not only providing written content like we've been talking about, but we also have 12 podcasts that are part of our podcast network. We have 20,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel. So it's just kind of providing a lot of different kinds of content. We also do these live streams. We did one last night where we do a watch party where we all kind of get on and watch a game together, talk about the big storylines around the NBA. So I think whenever I was starting out and whenever I was, coming up in high school, they would tell you, focus on one thing and get really good at it. And it's totally changed now. You have to be able to do everything. Right. I never thought I'd be hosting a podcast or, doing video or any of that kind of stuff. Like I just wanted to write initially, but if you're in this business, you have to, be able to wear a lot of different hats. So we've definitely tried to provide tons of different kinds of content. And the big thing for us is just continuing to get our name out there. We're a year and a half old now, not even almost a year and a half old. So the big thing is just getting the basketball news name out there, continuing to hire, up and coming writers, add new players. We've had some conversations with some, pretty big name players that could come on board and host their own podcast with us, do videos, write some articles. Kenyon Martin is another player that does stuff with us. He has a podcast and writes an article every month. So that's the big thing for us, just continuing to expand, add new people, and then, just try to provide as many different kinds of content as possible, whether it's articles, videos, live streams, podcasts. That's kind of the big thing. I think as we kind of get bigger, we can do more things too. We will be able to, launch other sports, bring in even more notable names and things like that. But yeah, that's kind of the trajectory that we're trying to go on right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, I mean, I was trained to do one thing right, and that's the only thing I don't do anymore.
Right.
You have to learn how to do everything. And that is, there are so many, particularly young folks who are coming out of, now I sound old, I use the word folks, but they're coming out of college, and they, like I said, they know how to do social media, they know how to do YouTube, they know how to do podcasts, they know how to do everything. Writing seems to be the last thing, actually, and yet there's really no place for them to go, because in a lot of cases, the mainstream outlets are not set up with an infrastructure for that. They're not, the newspapers are not producing consistent podcasts, they don't have YouTube channels. And so they're going to outlets like yours to create, and then people are going to consume it. We're hoping to integrate some more of your content with us as well as we go forward, because I do think there are a lot of Fanalysts who will be able to benefit from it. But I'll just kind of end here. Give me your one, when you're breaking into the business, what was your welcome to the business moment? You're being chaperoned by your father to games, but everybody's got that first interview that they always remember that maybe they were nervous about or something along those lines. Give me what that was.
So my first interview was, I think, my first game. I went and talked to Jameer Nelson, and he was a player that I was a big fan of before I started, covering games. And it was actually him and Dwight Howard's rookie year, so they were rookies. But I went up to Jameer, and he was super friendly and was giving me great answers. Then after the interview, he was like, "Are you getting paid for this?" And he starts asking, other people. They're like, "How much is this guy getting paid?" And then I was like, "I just do it for fun." And he was like, "Okay, I'm your agent now. I'm getting you a contract. We're getting you paid. Like, put me on the phone with your editor right now. Like, this is unacceptable." Like, he starts joking about like child labor laws and stuff like that. So that one stood out because he was a really good sport and gave me great stuff, but then also, had some funny comments there. But yeah, again, early on, I was able to get interviews with a lot of these, like Tim Duncan talked to me one-on-one, Grant Hill, Kobe Bryant.
You're the one in Tim Duncan's case that he talked to one-on-one.
At the moment, I had no idea that it was a thing that he just didn't talk to the media. And then as I started covering more and like getting older, I was like, wow, it's kind of crazy that he did that. But again, I was a 14-year-old, and I think he didn't want to be the mean jerk that said no to a 14-year-old. So yeah.
Well, I'll tell you my first before we go, because I did not have a Jameer Nelson experience. I had a Charles Barkley experience. I was at grad school at Columbia, and they took us to one class, Sandy Padway's class, our sports journalism class, the only sports journalism class I took there. And it was a Suns Knicks game, and the first person that I saw in the locker room was Charles Barkley, and he just looked at me and said, "Why are you talking to me?" And that was basic. And for some reason, I stayed in the business now for 27 years since. Alex, we appreciate it. You can follow him at Alex Kennedy NBA, and of course, you can go to basketballnews.com. That's where you want to go for all this great NBA content from a lot of really smart folks in the industry. You can tell you not just why players, who's going from where to where, but why a player is going from where to where. Alex, thanks for the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.